Hey guys, part 3 of our video around how to diagnose and fix a 4-stroke bike that's burning oil. So in our case, burning a shitload of oil. I've gone through a whole process to try to figure out how to get this fixed. I walk you through that process in 3 separate videos, and it's worth watching those, especially part 1, because that's gonna tell you how to do what's called a leak down test, which is gonna help you diagnose the problem that you have. So basically, bike can burn oil for basically 2 reasons. There's oil on top of the valve train that lubricates the valve lifters. That can leak down around the valve stems, past the valve stem seals, and can get into the airflow pathway and burn in the cylinder, and that's gonna cause what we're seeing potentially. The other way is it can come up past the rings from underneath in the crank, up around the cylinder and burn that way. The way you figure out which is which is you're gonna do something called a leak down test. I've got a whole video link in the description about how to do a leak down test, but basically you put pressure on the cylinder and you figure out where the air is going. If you're not losing any air, then it's not your piston, then it's your valve stems. Watch part 2, show you how to change the valve stem seals. If you are losing air, very likely it's the piston rings, and that's what we're gonna show you how to fix in this video, or diagnose and fix, I should say. So if you've come to this video, chances are you either already changed the valve stem seals, which I did unnecessarily, or you did the diagnosis in part 1 of the video, and you're now trying to figure out how to solve bad piston rings. So it could be rings, could be wear on the cylinder wall, it could be a few different things, but we're gonna show you how to dive down into that part of the engine in this video and figure out, I'm probably at a minimum gonna change the piston rings. I don't know what we'll find. Maybe we need a new piston or new cylinder walls or whatever. I'm not quite sure. Hopefully it's not that serious, but in any case, we're gonna figure it out. And as we walk through this particular video, we're gonna show you guys how to find those problems and how to fix whatever I happen to find on the bike that I'm working on. So let me get the bike in the studio and let's get stuff pulled out and show you how to accomplish this task. Let's go. Okay, so I'm gonna move pretty fast through this part of the process. I've already prepped the bike, which means pull the plastics, pull the tank, drain the coolant. I'm not gonna drain the oil because that's gonna sit at like static oil levels down here, like when the bike's off. I've already loosened a lot of the bolts because I was doing the compression leak down testing before this. So we're gonna pull the valve cover, it's already loose. Then you're gonna lock the whole bike in TDC because we're gonna be moving the piston and things like that, and we need to be able to bring it back. We won't lock it in TDC until we're putting things back together. Because we're gonna take it out of alignment anyway. That's where we're gonna undo the timing. And so when we're putting things back together, what we'll do is bring the piston back to TDC, lock it there, and then when we put the cylinder back in place and like get up to the valve train, then we'll line the valve train up to it, and we know that the piston will be locked in place. So I'm gonna pull the valve train, pull the cam sprocket, pull the cam, take the chain, like secure it, and then I'm just gonna work my way down, pull the head, and then attack the cylinder. So I'll show some clips here and there of some of the bits of the process, but I'm gonna dive right in now. Pull the valve cover by rocking it forward and then pivoting it out to the left. So, yeah, so there are 4 bolts that hold the cam in place. These 2 hold this bracket that lets you pull the cam sprocket out, and the back 2 let you pull the rods that hold the lifters. We'll need to remove all plugs like this one from the other side that connect to the head because we're going to be pulling the head. I've already taken the coolant lines off. While you're in here working on the top stuff, it's a good idea to stuff a rag in here. You really don't want to drop components down into the bottom side of the engine because we're going to be going pretty far in, but we're hopefully not splitting the cases, and so we don't want to drop stuff down into the bottom if we can help it. So with the screws removed from this bracket, you can lift this bracket out, and this here is what actually holds the cam sprocket in place. So your cam is now free. With these 2 screws removed, you can pull out the rods that hold the valve lifters in place. You'll need to thread a screw into the ends of them. This screw is the one that holds the gas tank on the bike, so it's a perfect size. And you'll see these just pull out like this. There's a front and back to these, so keep them in the same order that you took them out from. There's also an outside end and an inside end. So the end that's inside is not threaded. The outside end is threaded. That's where we just pulled it from. You'll want that to be outside when you put them back in, or you'll have trouble getting them out in the future. There's also an up and a down when you put these back in. This like cutout spot for the screw head is what needs to go up. And with those rods out, you'll be able to lift the valve lifters out. And then you're gonna use a magnet, and we're gonna grab the valve shims from the top of the valve stack. It's these little guys. And you need to keep them in the same order that they come out from, because these are all different sizes. This is how you set your valve clearance, by changing the size of these, the thickness of these. So make sure that you know which exact valve the shim came off of, or you're gonna have to recheck and reset your valve clearances when you're done. Next, we're gonna remove tension on the cam chain by removing the cam chain tensioner, which is this little guy. You do that by first pulling the center bolt, which is gonna release the spring that's inside. You wanna make sure you don't lose the spring, so catch whatever comes out. So it comes out like this. You can see there's the bolt, there's a washer, and there's the spring. You can then remove the 2 bolts that hold the tensioner itself in place. And here's the tensioner. So it's got a gasket. It's a good idea to replace it. I've gotten away with not doing that in the past, but if you can get one, replace it. Here's how the tensioner works. That spring presses this little rod in against this chain guide, and that's what tensions the chain. To release that pressure, you press down on the little tab here, and you'll be able to slide that way back in. This is auto tightening, right? So that spring puts pressure on this rod, which presses it in as the chain wears and takes up slack until this is out of adjustment at the very end, at which point you have to change the cam chain. So there's talk about like how many clicks of adjustment you have left. This is what they're talking about. Now my cam sprocket will be loose, or the whole cam rather, and you can pull it out of the guides and tilt it down like this. And then you can drop the timing chain off the back of it like so. And then we're gonna pull the cam, the whole cam and sprocket out of the engine. But first I'm gonna grab some zip ties, and I'm gonna make like a carrier for the cam chain, and I'm gonna tie it up here so it doesn't drop to the bottom of the engine and disappear on me. And then I can really carefully remove the cam. So that will come out like that. This is your auto decompression mechanism, and your lobes, your sprocket, and this is where the one bearing runs, this is where the other bearing runs. So you can kind of check out all those surfaces if you're worried about any of that. Next, we're gonna release the engine mounts from both sides. They both look exactly like this. So I'm just gonna loosen these screws. Actually, I'm gonna pull it off entirely because I need to be able to wiggle the head around and the cylinder to lift them out, and I want those out of the way. I'll leave it hanging like that. Same thing on the other side. Then I need to remove the exhaust header from the head, and to do that I'm going to pop off the 2 springs that hold it in place here. There's no bolts, just these springs, and they're a little bit hard to get to, so good luck. You're then going to remove the head bolts, take them off in a crisscross pattern and a little at a time, like in 3 stages, so you don't warp the head. And then there's this little bolt, this little guy, that comes out from the front here that holds this section together. Once you've got them loose, you can just pull those bolts to get the head loose. There is a washer on each bolt, so make sure you get that. And I like to keep these bolts in the same order. There's at least a side difference between them because some are inside the valve cover and all oily, and others are outside. I don't know if it makes much difference, but it doesn't hurt. With the head bolts free, I'm finally going to remove this rag because it's now in the way, and I'm going to gently pry off the intake boot with this big screwdriver. Okay, maybe once this thing's free. And we should be able to wiggle the head loose. Yep, it's loose. Now there are 2 dowel pins underneath right here. They really easily could fall. This channel goes like all the way down, and it's really easy to lose the dowel pins down into the engine if they happen to fall out. So I think what I'm going to do is try to get a rag in that channel. So the intake boot really does need to come off. It's being a pain in the butt. There we go. Okay, I can see one of the dowel pins, and the other one is up in the engine, or up in the head. That makes me more nervous. If it's sitting down in the cylinder, that's fine. When it's up in the head, it could fall. So I've got a finger on it, I'm gonna hold on to it. All right, it seems pretty set in there. The other thing I've got to do now is drop my cam chain out of the head and then re-secure it. I'm gonna add another zip tie and put it down here to the shift lever. Just don't want to drop it down in, you know. Dowel seems pretty secure, but it still makes me nervous. I am gonna stuff a rag in here, and then it's the intake boot that's binding. There we go. Once that pops, this thing's pretty easy to get out. Kind of finagle it out of the engine bay here, and there's your head. And so if you wanted to do like the valve stem seals, you could now easily use your valve stem seal tool and get on there. Okay, so now we're gonna start putting things back together again. We've got all the new parts in hand, which took a couple of days, so be prepared for that. This is the oil skirt. This spring looking thing goes inside it. That goes on the lower hole. This is the compression ring. The gaps in these two rings need to be 180 degrees off of each other. So opposite sides like that when they go on. We're gonna put these on. You're supposed to have the piston above the cylinder, and there's a special tool that clamps these rings together like this so that you can get the cylinder on the piston. I don't have the special tool, and I have the cylinder off with the piston in the bike. So I'm gonna be doing this totally backwards, and we're gonna see how hard that is to do. I noticed just now that the oil skirt at least has top labeled on it, so you'll wanna watch for that. I don't think it looks any different, but it does say top. 180 degrees off of each other. You've got to have the spring inside the oil skirt ring. So we're gonna put the spring inside the skirt, and then we're gonna try to slip this on and get it in place. Take that back. I'm gonna try to put the skirt on first. Try it that way. Or sorry, the spring. Yeah, that's pretty easy to do. Yeah, that's in place. It's like way too big for installation. That makes it like easy to get on the piston, but it's gonna be a little bit challenging to get the piston in the cylinder, I suspect. But I'm gonna rotate that around to the back, and then we're gonna try for the compression ring. Put the N marking up. I don't know what it means, maybe nothing. So those are 180 degrees off of each other. I just realized that there are two dowel pins that line the cylinder up with the base, and it's my luck that those stayed in the engine, but you're gonna wanna watch for those when you're doing your job. Now, I'm gonna pull the base gasket, get it up around the timing chain and the piston, and of course these guides, and we're gonna replace the base gasket with a new one. These guides slide out. There's like a spot that they sit in right here, so you want to make sure those are set. You need this little hole to be offset to the left slightly. The base gasket's set on the dowel pins. Your guides back in place. I have knocked the piston rings loose doing this. I'm gonna fix those. Okay, so now we're gonna clean the cylinder a little bit. I mean, just wipe it down. I don't want any like dust. It's been sitting here for 3 days. I don't want any dust on it. And then we are gonna oil it before we start to do this process. I'm just gonna use a little of clean motor oil to like lube it up so that the rings and stuff have the best chance of sliding up inside it. That's like nice and clean. I don't see anything but perfectly smooth surfaces on here. I really don't see any damage, so I'm gonna just go ahead and use it as is. I'm gonna just wet my finger with some clean oil and then just like oil it in here, the outside, so it'll slide down into the base properly. Pins, surfaces, perfect. Now this is gonna be tricky, but get the cylinder back in here, and we're gonna then try to feed the piston up into it. Okay, so I went off camera for a while to figure this shit out. It's actually really difficult. It might be possible to do in bike, but I couldn't figure it out. So I ended up pulling the wrist pin, I think it's called, out. There's a spring clip in the side that you can press and remove, and then you can drive the wrist pin out, and then you can take the piston off the bike. And then I took the whole thing to a workbench, and there I was able to like squeeze the rings and get it set. And now I've got the cylinder set on the piston. The piston's remounted on the wrist pin and all that. And now I'm gonna try to slide the cylinder down into place, and like I'm sort of gently moving the piston up in the cylinder. You don't want to mess anything up, so you got to be a little bit careful with this whole process. You don't want to like scratch, get the piston crooked in the cylinder either. So there's kind of a lot of things going on, and of course this timing chain's got to get fed up through the cylinder side. Sure the base gasket is set on the pins, and then I'm sliding the piston up in as I go. At this point, I think I'm gonna lock the piston in place using that screw on the other side of the engine so that I can push the cylinder down on it. Oh my God, and to do that, I've got to drop the skid plate, which I was hoping not to have to do this round. Okay, so with a little bit of finagling, I got the cylinder dropped back down into place. It's sitting on the base gasket. Everything's lined up, it's beautiful. You can see the piston's not quite at TDC, so we need it to be at TDC. We've got to lock it there. It's got a few millimeters here, like it's dropped, which is fine. We're gonna, I think the bike's up in 5th gear. If not, put it in 5th or 6th, and then you can rotate the back tire and you can get that to come up just a little bit. We wanna lock it in the TDC position so that once we put the head back on, we can safely line the timing chain up on the head to TDC, and we know the piston will match. So we're gonna do that now. I'm gonna drag this around a little bit, get it lined up. It's right there, flush with the top edge. That's where we want it. Now we're gonna lock that little locking nut on the other side back in place, and we can move on to the head. All right, great. Now it's time to reinstall the head gasket and then the head. When you get your camshaft set to TDC, remove this screw, take off this ring, and thread the screw back in, and you can tighten it up against the crank, I think, or something in there to hold everything in place. Of course, make sure that when you're putting everything back together at the end, that you make sure you put the washer back on and screw this back in and tighten it up snug, or you'll be leaking oil all over the place. If you forget to put the washer back in and screw it back in, you're gonna lock the engine, and when you try to go start it, you're gonna fuck stuff up. All right, we're gonna start reassembling everything here. We're gonna start with the head gasket. This screw is offset to this side to match up with this. I like to put these 2 shims into the bottom of the cylinder and not the head, because I don't want to have them fall off the head and fall into the engine gap here. In fact, I'm gonna put a rag in while I do this. It's worth being extremely careful because it's a real pain in the ass if you drop stuff down into the engine. There we go. Rag out of the way. Now I'm gonna put the head gasket on those pins. Now I can safely bring my head into play. You wanna be careful you don't ding up your radiators too much. They're easy to mess up. Go, that's enough to pull the timing chain up through. Hang that up here this time. Then we're gonna finagle the head into place. The hardest part is the intake boot. There we go. The intake boot slipped on. It's set in place. You can now tighten down the head bolts. So I'm gonna thread them into place first. Again, put a rag in here. Really crappy to start over at this point. Drop all the bolts in, screw them hand tight. Tighten them in 3 stages in a cross pattern. So you're gonna go across, and 3 stages meaning hand tight, do like 20 foot-pounds, and then the full torque is like 39.5 or something. I'm just gonna do 40 foot-pounds. Then we can remove the rag, and we're gonna put in the bolt that goes down here, and that's only to like 10 foot-pounds or something. I'm not gonna torque wrench it. I have a pretty good sense for how it should feel. And then we're gonna start rebuilding the cam. So we're gonna slide the cam itself in. This needs to be done with the chain. The chain's gonna go around it. And then I'm gonna pop my zip ties out of the way. And then we're gonna lift the cam chain up on the cam sprocket so we can slide the cam all the way in. No, we actually have to pull it out a little bit so that it drops down, the cam drops down, and then we can get the chain on it. And this is where you're gonna start to set your timing. So there's a little divot mark in the surface of the cam sprocket. That's gonna need to go straight up. And there's a divot mark here in the base, and those two need to line up with each other. If you're gonna be a tooth off to the left, because the chain's gonna tension from this side and pull you probably about 1 tooth back. So I need to go 1 tooth more left. So now my mark lines up here to here, but when the cam chain tensions, yeah, it pulls right back to the center. It's never perfect, but you got to get it within a tooth of being off. Then we can install the cam chain tensioner, which is this doohickey, and I've got a new gasket for it. can only go on one way. You see if you got it backwards, like it doesn't line up. And the 2 screws that hold that in place. Snug these up, don't make them too tight. Then we're gonna put the spring that tensions the cam chain tensioner in place. We don't need to do anything, it auto sets. So this whole spring gets compressed into the hole and then you screw the nut in. And tighten up that bolt. That's it, the chain will tension itself. Don't squeeze on these because you'll pre-tension it and it'll take care of itself. You'll make sure this is pressed in all the way and then we're gonna start to put the top of everything back together. So put rag back in here to avoid dropping parts down in the engine. You now need to replace the valve shims into the top of the buckets on the top of the valve springs. It's really important that those go back in the same order that you took them out, or the same locations that you took them out of. Then we can put the valve lifters in. This pin goes with the cutout side up and the threaded end out to the right. Push it in until the holes line up. Same thing on the exhaust side. Then we're going to replace this bracket that holds the cam sprocket in place, making sure that this edge gets down into the groove on the sprocket to hold everything in place. Then we're going to replace the 2 screws that hold the cam lock in place, and then the 2 screws that hold the lifter pins on the other side. And we'll snug them down. Now we're going to install the valve cover. I've put a new ring on here so it doesn't sit as cleanly in the cover as I would like it to. I mean, it'll seat, but what I mean is it's going to fall out while I'm installing it, which is going to be super annoying. So I'm going to try to hold on to it while I finagle this in place. That works. And then we're going to drop all the bolts in to tighten that in. There's also a little seal up in this inside here that I've changed. Now we're going to put these engine braces back on. These cables go behind and then you just replace all the bolts we took out of them. So the larger bolt obviously goes back where it came from the bottom. Might be a good idea to Loctite these. I'm not going to right now. I'll do that later if everything works out. Snug those down. And same thing on the other side. Next, we're going to reinstall the exhaust header. Pretty easy, just like that. And then we'll put those springs in, including this long one from the other side. Don't forget to tighten the ring for the intake boot. Of course, make sure the intake boot is on all the way. In my case, it is. And then you'll reinstall the water hoses. Don't forget the clamps that go on them. Put the spark plug and wires back in. And from there, you can put the tank and everything back on and start it up and see if your oil leak is fixed. Before you start the engine, it's a good idea to turn it over by hand manually. The way I'm gonna do that is rock it up on the kickstand, and I have the bike up in 5th or 6th gear, and I'm just gonna turn the rear wheel around, and I'm gonna do a couple of full rotations because I wanna make sure that nothing interferes. I wanna make sure my timing's off. If it's not, your valves will come down and hit the piston, and you'll fuck things up if you're trying to run it that way. So I'm gonna do it gently, using the rear wheel to crank the engine. We're gonna make sure that everything clears a couple of rounds before we try to start it or anything. Before you do anything, double check that lock screw for the crank on the other side of the engine has been reinstalled with the ring in place so that it's not locking anything. All right, I've got a couple of thumps of the valves and nothing's hitting, so I think I'm okay. And it's fixed. I'm so thankful. I've been a month without the bike because I did this job wrong once and I had to wait a week for parts, and it's been a whole saga. So thanks for coming along on this journey. All 3 parts, I hope, are helpful. I split them out so that you could dive in only to the specific part that you wanted. But in the end, I actually ended up changing the valve stem seals and the piston rings. In between those, it's fixed my oil consumption issue for now. I've had the bike hot, rode it around a bit to set the new rings. Everything looks great. I will note that because I drove it for probably 6 weeks, or rode it for 6 weeks while it was sucking in oil pretty badly, I've got some oil residue or residual oil all in the exhaust pipe and maybe even in the glass pack of the muffler. So what I noticed when I first started it up after changing the piston rings, it didn't smoke right away, but as the bike started to get hot, as the pipe started to get hot, it did start to smoke just a little bit, and that made me nervous at first. But then I drove it around for a while and that cleared up. And what I realized was there's actually oil all coating the inside of the exhaust pipe. Unfortunately, it was burning, I'm telling you, it was burning a shitload, way more than a 2-stroke. It was burning a lot of fucking oil. And some of that oil was still in the pipe. Not in a puddle, but coating the sides, partially burned and stuff like that. And so as the pipe got hot, that stuff's burning off. So I'm anticipating it's gonna continue to burn off the next couple of rides, but drove the bike around on my track for, 20 minutes or something after having let it idle for a bit, and that definitely cleared up. It's running great. It's got nice snap to it. I think that pretty well solved the problem, and that residual smoke is just that burn off. So if you see something like that, maybe that's helpful to you. Thanks a ton for watching these videos, guys. We hope they're helpful. If you have questions or comments, leave them in, questions or thoughts, leave them in the comments down below. I should say, check out our chin mounts. Like and subscribe to this video. We've got a really cool podcast that you don't want to miss. So I get you don't want to watch a ton of how-to videos. That's fine. You can ignore all those. You do want to watch the podcast ones because those are cool. We interview like Graham Jarvis and Cody Webb and Cooper Abbott and Anthony Johnston and like a ton of top racers and suspension guys and photographers. It's a ton of fun. So come along for those. Check out links down in the description to our shop, to the other parts of this video series, and to our Instagram channel where you can see what footage looks like when you shoot it with the chin mounts that we use. Thanks, guys. We'll see you next time.